You can't park here. This is for authorized personnel only.
I have a veteran's plate.
I don't care what kind of plate you have. Read the sign. Authorized personnel. That means hospital staff, not every Tom, Dick, and Harry with a sob story.
Robert Jenkins had just parked his gray sedan in the Veterans Affairs Medical Center parking lot at 10 in the morning on a Saturday in May. He was 62 years old, a retired veteran of the United States Army with 28 years of service, and was there for his monthly routine appointment at the cardiology clinic. Robert wore his Army veteran cap, a navy blue jacket, and carried his bag with medical documentation. He had parked in a regular space in the large parking lot serving the medical complex, carefully checking he was within the lines and that the parking meter was working properly. Everything seemed normal, just another routine medical visit. Robert was organizing his papers on the passenger seat when he heard aggressive knocking on the driver's window. He looked up and saw a parking officer standing outside his car, wearing a brown and beige uniform with an identification badge. The woman was white, appeared to be about 45 years old, and her expression was one of immediate irritation. Robert lowered the window, expecting perhaps there was some problem with the meter, or that she needed to warn him about some parking rule he was unaware of. But before he could say anything, the officer began speaking in an accusatory tone. She asked what he was doing there, why he had parked in that space, and if he had permission to use that parking lot. Robert was confused by the immediate hostility. He responded politely that he had a medical appointment at the Veterans Center, that he was a retired Army veteran, and that he had every right to use that parking lot. The officer, whose badge identified her as S. Morrison, looked at Robert with obvious skepticism. She said the parking lot was for VA patients, not for anyone who decided to stop there. Robert explained again that he was a patient, that he had a scheduled appointment, that he came there regularly. Morrison seemed not to believe him. She said he didn't look like a veteran, that people often lied to use the free parking, and that she was going to need to see proof he had an appointment. Robert felt the familiar tension in his stomach, that uncomfortable feeling that came when he realized he was being treated differently because of his race. He had experienced this many times throughout his life, even during his years of military service, where it should have been irrelevant. But that didn't make it easier. He took a deep breath and told Morrison he had his veteran identification card and appointment documentation. He began searching in his bag for the documents. Morrison said impatiently that he had 10 seconds to produce proof, or she was going to tow him and issue a citation for unauthorized use of the parking lot. The threat was absurd, given he was clearly in a public VA parking lot and had every right to be there. Robert found his veteran identification card, an official plastic card issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs that clearly identified Robert Allen Jenkins, First Sergeant retired, United States Army, with his service dates from 1984 to 2012. He also pulled out the appointment confirmation letter he had brought with him. He extended both documents to Morrison through the window. She took them brusquely and examined them with an expression that made clear she was looking for a reason to discredit them. After looking for several seconds, she handed the documents back and said they looked suspicious, that anyone could forge documents these days, and that she still wasn't convinced. Robert couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had provided official government identification that clearly established his veteran status and his right to use those facilities. What more could she possibly want? He asked directly what exactly about the documents seemed suspicious. Morrison didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she said Robert was being defensive, that defensive behavior was a sign someone was hiding something, and that she had authority to remove unauthorized vehicles from the parking lot. Robert asked if she checked everyone's documents this way, or if he was being treated differently. Morrison was visibly irritated by the implication and said she was just doing her job. Robert decided he had had enough. He pulled out his cell phone and began recording the interaction. He said in a clear voice it was 10:03 in the morning on May 11, 2024, that he was at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center parking lot, that he had provided valid veteran identification and appointment documentation, and that parking officer Morrison was threatening to tow his vehicle without legitimate cause. Morrison saw the phone recording and became immediately more agitated. She said Robert didn't have permission to record her, that it was an invasion of privacy, and that he needed to turn off the phone immediately. Robert responded calmly. He was on public property and had every right to record interactions with public employees in the exercise of their duties. Morrison then did something that revealed exactly where her attitudes really were. She said people like Robert always caused problems, always claimed discrimination when they were simply asked to follow rules like everyone else, that she was tired of dealing with people who played the race card every time they didn't get what they wanted. The words came out with barely disguised frustration, and each one was clearly captured on Robert's video. He asked what exactly she meant by people like him. Morrison realized she had said too much. She tried to backtrack, saying she referred to people who didn't follow proper procedure, but the damage was done. The implication had been crystal clear. Robert maintained remarkable calm considering the situation. He told Morrison he was going in for his appointment now, that his car was legally parked, that he had provided all necessary documentation, and that if she had a problem with that, she was free to contact her superiors. Morrison said he wasn't going anywhere until she finished her investigation. Robert asked what investigation? Investigation of what? He had shown valid identification issued by the federal government, had appointment documentation, was in a public parking lot designed specifically for veterans using the VA Medical Center. What legal basis did she have to detain him? Morrison didn't have a good answer for that. She said she had authority to manage the parking lot as she saw fit. That's when another vehicle pulled into the space next to Robert's. A white man of similar age got out wearing a casual jacket and baseball cap. He looked at the scene, saw Morrison standing next to Robert's car, and walked straight to the medical center building without being stopped or questioned in any way. Robert pointed this out immediately. He asked Morrison why that man wasn't stopped and questioned about his authorization to use the parking lot. Why wasn't he asked to provide proof of being a veteran or having an appointment? What was the difference between that man and Robert besides the color of his skin? Morrison said she couldn't be everywhere at once, that the other man had probably come there before, and she recognized him. But Robert had been coming there monthly for 3 years. If Morrison worked that parking lot regularly, she should recognize him too. He pointed this out, and Morrison said she didn't memorize every face. The logic was starting to crumble under scrutiny. Robert said he was going to file a formal complaint about his treatment, that Morrison's behavior clearly constituted racial profiling, and that the video he had recorded would be evidence. Morrison laughed dismissively and said complaints didn't go anywhere, that the department always supported its parking officers, and that Robert's word against hers wouldn't mean anything. She clearly didn't understand the world had changed, that video evidence altered the calculation dramatically. Robert finally got out of his car, locked it, and began walking toward the medical center building. Morrison followed him for a few steps, saying he was making a mistake, that his car would be towed, that she was going to ensure he was banned from using that parking lot in the future. Robert stopped and turned to face her. He said something that was perfectly captured on his still recording video. He said he had served 28 years in the United States Army, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, had earned a Bronze Star for valor, and wasn't going to be intimidated by a parking officer with a chip on her shoulder in a VA parking lot. That if she wanted to tow a legally parked disabled veteran's car, she should go ahead and try. But he would make sure everyone knew about it. Robert entered the medical center, still processing what had just happened. He checked in at the cardiology clinic reception, where the receptionist greeted him warmly by name, clearly recognizing him from his regular monthly visits. While waiting to be called, Robert reviewed the video he had recorded, ensuring he had captured everything clearly. He had. Morrison's immediate hostility, her refusal to accept valid documentation, her comments about people like him playing the race card, and the obvious comparison with the white man who passed without being questioned. It was undeniable evidence of differential treatment based on race. After his appointment, which lasted about 40 minutes, Robert returned to the parking lot expecting to find his car towed or with a citation on the windshield. But surprisingly, his car was still exactly where he had left it, intact and without a citation. Morrison was on the other side of the parking lot, apparently checking other vehicles, but when she saw Robert emerging from the building, she deliberately avoided looking in his direction. Robert got in his car and drove home, his mind already working on what steps to take next. He had served his country for almost 3 decades. He had literally put his life at risk multiple times, and now he was being treated like a criminal when trying to use the very medical services he had earned through that service. When he got home, Robert immediately went to his computer, He found the website of the parking department that managed the VA facilities and located the online complaint form. He filled out each section meticulously, describing the incident in chronological detail, quoting Morrison's specific statements, and explaining how she had treated him versus the white veteran who arrived later. He uploaded the video he had recorded as attached evidence. Then he did something additional. He sent copies of the same complaint to the VA Medical Center Administrator's office, to the local veterans organization, and to an investigative news reporter he knew covered stories of discrimination against veterans. The reporter, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who worked for the local television station, responded within 2 hours. She said she had reviewed Robert's video and wanted to do a story about the incident if he was willing to give an interview. Robert agreed. Jennifer came to his house the next day with a cameraman. She interviewed Robert extensively about his experience, about his military service history, and about how he felt being treated that way in a place that should honor his sacrifice. Robert spoke calmly but with clear emotion. He said he wasn't doing this for revenge but on principle. That if it happened to him, it was probably happening to other veterans, especially veterans of color who might not have the resources or confidence to fight back. The story aired on the evening news broadcast 2 days after the incident. Jennifer had done excellent investigative work. She not only showed Robert's video and told his story, but also interviewed 3 other Black and Latino veterans who reported similar treatment from Morrison in the same parking lot. One man described how Morrison had questioned the authenticity of his disabled veteran plate despite it being clearly displayed. Another woman said Morrison had threatened to call the police when she refused to leave her legally parked space after Morrison claimed she didn't look old enough to be a veteran. A pattern was emerging of Morrison specifically targeting veterans of color with suspicion and hostility she didn't equally apply to white veterans. Public reaction was immediate and furious. Veterans organizations issued statements condemning Robert's treatment and demanding accountability. People flooded the parking department's social media with comments demanding Morrison be fired. The story was shared thousands of times on social media platforms. Civil rights groups highlighted the case as an example of how even those who served their country weren't immune to racial profiling. The VA Medical Center issued a statement saying they were taking the allegations extremely seriously. That discrimination of any kind was intolerable, especially at facilities designed to serve veterans, and that a full investigation was underway. The parking department placed Morrison on paid administrative leave the day after the news report. They issued a statement saying they were taking the allegations seriously, but couldn't comment on personnel matters during an ongoing investigation. But public pressure continued mounting. Veterans began organizing protests outside the VA Medical Center, not against the facilities, but in support of Robert and other veterans who had been mistreated. Signs said, "Veterans deserve respect and end discrimination at the VA." Media covered the protests extensively, keeping the story in the news day after day. Investigators interviewed Robert in detail about his experience. They reviewed the video multiple times, asking questions about timing, about what Morrison said, about how other drivers were treated. Robert provided everything they could need, including the names of other veterans who had come to him after the news report sharing their own experiences with Morrison. Investigators then began reviewing security camera footage from the parking lot over the past 6 months. What they found was even more incriminating than Robert's video alone. There were multiple recorded examples of Morrison approaching veterans of color, demanding extensive documentation, becoming combative when questioned, and there were multiple examples of white veterans passing by her without even a second glance. One particularly revealing video showed Morrison stopping a Latino veteran who had a disabled veteran plate clearly visible. She had questioned him for almost 15 minutes, demanding to see not just his veteran identification, but also his military discharge papers, his medical records proving disability, and his vehicle registration. Meanwhile, 3 vehicles with white drivers parked, entered the building, and returned without Morrison even looking in their direction. The disparity was so obvious it was impossible to argue it was coincidence or error in judgment. It was a systematic pattern of differential treatment clearly based on race. Investigators also discovered something more problematic. Records showed Morrison had received 2 previous formal complaints in the past 18 months, both alleging discriminatory treatment. One had come from an African-American veteran who alleged Morrison had called the police when he refused to leave a legally parked space after she questioned his identification. The other had come from a Middle Eastern veteran who alleged Morrison made comments suggesting he didn't look American. Both complaints had been superficially investigated and dismissed, with Morrison receiving only verbal warning about professionalism. There was no record of additional training or close monitoring of her behavior after these complaints. This revealed a bigger problem beyond just Morrison. The department's complaint system was clearly inadequate. Complaints of racial discrimination had been filed, but not taken seriously. No meaningful action had been taken until video evidence and media attention made it impossible to ignore. How many other veterans had been mistreated but didn't have video to prove it? How many simply accepted the bad treatment because they didn't know how to fight back or feared complaining would make things worse? Robert's case was exposing not just individual misconduct, but systemic failure. 3 weeks after the incident, the parking department issued its findings. They determined Morrison had violated multiple department policies, including equal treatment of all customers, professionalism in interactions, and following appropriate procedures for verifying authorized parking. Most importantly, they determined she had demonstrated a pattern of racial profiling by disproportionately targeting veterans of color for scrutiny while allowing white veterans to pass without questioning. The recommendation was immediate termination. The department director accepted the recommendation. Morrison was fired, effective immediately, with no chance of appeal given the clarity of video evidence and the documented pattern of behavior. Morrison tried to fight the termination through the Municipal Employees Union. Her lawyer argued she was being scapegoated, that a 15-year career was being destroyed by a misunderstanding captured on video, and that she deserved another chance with additional training instead of termination. But the arbitrator who reviewed the case sided with the department. The written decision cited not just the incident with Robert, but the demonstrable pattern of discriminatory behavior over months captured in multiple security camera recordings. The arbitrator wrote that public employees serving veterans had a special responsibility to treat everyone with dignity and respect, and that Morrison had fundamentally failed that responsibility repeatedly. The termination was upheld. Robert, meanwhile, had become an involuntary spokesperson for veterans facing discrimination. He was invited to speak at veterans organization conferences, appeared on podcasts discussing his experiences, and worked with advocacy groups to improve anti-discrimination policies at VA facilities across the country. He always emphasized he wasn't a hero for recording a video. The real problem was that veterans, especially veterans of color, often faced prejudice and disrespect in the very places that should honor their service, that his case just happened to be documented in a way that couldn't be denied or dismissed. The parking department implemented comprehensive changes. Every parking officer now went through mandatory 8-hour training on implicit bias, equal treatment, and recognizing appropriate veteran documentation. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers working at VA facilities. A new complaint system was established where discrimination complaints were automatically escalated for third-party review instead of being handled internally. And demographic data about who was stopped and questioned began being tracked and published quarterly to identify any patterns of unequal treatment. The VA Medical Center where everything happened held a town hall for veterans 3 months after the incident. The administrator publicly apologized to Robert for the treatment he received, acknowledged the system had failed to protect him and others from discrimination, and outlined the changes being implemented. Robert was present and spoke briefly. He said he accepted the apology, but that words needed to be followed by sustained action, that veterans had sacrificed too much to be treated as second-class citizens at their own medical facilities, that the real test wouldn't be whether changes were made today, but whether they were maintained long-term. Morrison gave a single interview after her termination with a small community publication. She claimed she had been treated unfairly, that the video didn't show full context, that she had been an exemplary parking officer for years. But when the interviewer asked directly about the pattern of treating veterans of color differently from White veterans captured in security recordings. She had no convincing answer. She said sometimes people from certain backgrounds seemed more suspicious, then backtracked from that statement when she realized how it sounded. The interview only confirmed what the video had already shown. Morrison had biases she either didn't recognize or refused to admit, and those biases had guided her actions until she finally faced consequences. Other veterans who had been mistreated by Morrison began coming forward publicly. One of them, a 68-year-old veteran named Carlos Mendez who had served in Vietnam, described how Morrison had made him feel less than human by repeatedly questioning whether his documents were real, suggesting he had purchased fake veteran identification. Carlos said he had carried that humiliation in silence for months, wondering if he should stop using the VA Medical Center entirely rather than risk another encounter with Morrison. Seeing Robert stand up had given him courage to share his own story. Others echoed similar sentiments. Robert had done what many wanted to do but were afraid to, and by doing so, he had created space for others to speak up too. The case also drew attention at the federal level. The Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington issued a national directive requiring all VA facilities to review their parking policies and employee training. The directive specifically cited Robert's incident as an example of why stronger oversight was needed. Guidelines were established about when and how parking officers could request documentation, emphasizing veterans shouldn't be subjected to excessive scrutiny or differential treatment based on appearance. The directive also required all parking officers at VA facilities to undergo certification in recognizing veteran credentials and training about the diversity of the veteran community. Robert received formal recognition from multiple veterans organizations. The local American Legion gave him an award for advocacy on behalf of veterans. The veterans of foreign wars invited him to be keynote speaker at their annual state convention. But the recognition that meant most to Robert came from an unexpected source. He received a handwritten letter from a young veteran who had recently served in Iraq. The young man wrote he had experienced something similar at a different VA parking lot but had felt powerless to do anything about it. Seeing Robert stand up, seeing that accountability was possible, had given the young veteran hope the system could improve. That letter reminded Robert why it had been important to resist. Morrison disappeared from public life after the unsuccessful interview. She eventually found work in the private sector, far from any position serving the public. Some acquaintances said she still saw herself as a victim, that she blamed Robert for ruining her career instead of acknowledging it was her own actions and attitudes that caused her downfall. Others said the experience had changed her, that she had begun confronting her own biases, though she never publicly apologized to the veterans she mistreated. Her legacy was permanently stained. When someone searched her name online, the first thing that appeared was the discrimination story. The video of her confrontation with Robert and accounts of her pattern of treating veterans of color unfairly. The 3-minute video Robert recorded that Saturday morning in May became widely used in training programs. Police academies used it to teach about implicit bias and the importance of treating everyone equally regardless of appearance. Public administration schools used it to discuss professional accountability and consequences of discrimination. Veterans organizations used it to educate veterans about their rights and encourage them to document and report unfair treatment. What Morrison had thought was just another veteran she could intimidate turned out to be the veteran who exposed years of misconduct and created systemic change. Robert continued his monthly visits to the VA Medical Center. Each time he parked in the same parking lot where everything happened, he thought about that day. The new parking officer staff, all trained under the new policies, greeted him politely without unduly questioning his presence. Some even recognized him from news coverage and expressed gratitude for him standing up. The parking lot felt different now, not just physically, but in energy. Veterans of all races and backgrounds parked and entered the building without harassment. It was how it should have been all along. But it took Robert's 3-minute video to expose the problem and force change. 2 years after the incident, the VA Medical Center dedicated a plaque in the parking lot honoring all veterans and reaffirming commitment to equal treatment. The dedication ceremony included Robert as a speaker. He stood in the same spot where Morrison had confronted him and spoke about the significance of the moment. He said the plaque was a reminder that vigilance was necessary to protect rights, that systems don't correct themselves automatically. They require people willing to speak up, document injustice, and demand accountability. That his video had lasted 3 minutes but represented decades of veterans suffering in silence. And that his hope was future generations of veterans would never have to go through what he went through. Robert's story became a defining example of how modern technology, specifically the ability to record video on cell phones, had changed power dynamics in encounters with authority. Morrison had operated with impunity for years because it was her word against that of veterans she mistreated. But video changed that calculation. There was no way to deny or reinterpret what was clearly captured on recording. Every word Morrison said, every discriminatory action she took, was preserved in digital evidence that couldn't be erased or revised. It was objective proof in an era where denial and gaslighting often allowed misconduct to continue unchecked. The case also highlighted broader disparity in how veterans of color were treated versus white veterans, not just in parking lots, but across all aspects of the VA system. Subsequent studies showed Black and Latino veterans often faced longer wait times for care, received lower disability ratings for similar conditions, and reported feeling less respected by VA staff compared to white veterans. Robert's video became a catalyst for examining and addressing these broader disparities. It didn't solve all problems, but it made it impossible to ignore that problems existed. For Robert personally, the incident changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had spent his military career following orders, working within the system, trusting institutions would treat him fairly. That morning in the parking lot forced him to confront that, even as a decorated veteran who had sacrificed so much, he could still be seen as suspicious, as less than, simply because of the color of his skin. It was painful, but also clarifying, and it transformed him from someone who accepted unfair treatment with weary resignation to someone who actively fought for change. He often said in speeches that 3 minutes recording video had accomplished more than 3 decades of polite silence ever could have. Morrison had said that day that people like Robert always caused problems, always claimed discrimination when asked to follow rules. But the video proved it wasn't about Robert causing problems. It was about Morrison treating people differently based on race and finally being held accountable when evidence made denial impossible. The rules she claimed to be enforcing were never applied equally. They were a selective weapon used to harass veterans of color while allowing white veterans to pass without questioning. And when someone finally documented that unequal treatment in a way that couldn't be ignored, her 15-year career ended in 3 minutes. The video remained online, archived by countless users, linked in news articles and training materials. It served as a permanent reminder of why documentation matters, why speaking up matters, and why constant vigilance is necessary to protect the rights of everyone, even those who served and sacrificed for their country. 3 minutes of cell phone video recorded by a retired veteran in a VA parking lot. That's all it took to end a corrupt parking officer's career, expose systemic failures, create national policy change, and inspire countless other veterans to stand up against discrimination. And every time Robert parked his gray sedan in that parking lot, he remembered that principle had prevailed over power, that evidence had overcome denial, and that sometimes the simplest act of resistance, like recording a 3-minute video, could change everything. Morrison had thought she could intimidate him. She had underestimated who he was, what he stood for, and the era of justice in which they lived. Her career ended where her discrimination had begun, and the video that captured it all became testament to why no one, no matter how small their authority, is above accountability when their actions are brought to light